Hello and welcome back to the Assassination Simulation, Chapter 3. My name is Tess, I'm the author, and as always, if you have any comments or critiques, I would love to hear them. Chapter 3. Evelyn slowly drifted into consciousness. She yawned, opened her eyes, and froze. The ceiling above her was white and curved, with no sharp corners where it met the walls. She sat bolt upright, staring around at the strange room. The bed she lay upon was a normal twin bed straight out of a college dorm room. Everything else in the room looked strange. The ceilings and walls seamlessly fused with the floor, and the bedside table grew directly up from it. Everything was made from the same white material. As her eyes traveled around the room, she saw an entrance, an open arch topped by a thin rod that grew across the apex of the doorway. Inexplicably, the rod threaded through familiar plastic rings, holding up what looked to be a normal shower curtain. It was just opaque enough to prevent her from seeing through. Memory hit her. The dead man, the alien, and her offer. Her head felt odd, not fuzzy or painful, but different than normal in a way she couldn't explain. She swung her feet to the ground, looking down at the clothing she was wearing. They had replaced the scrubs the police had given her with some kind of uniform. The pants were long, spacious, and comfortable, topped with a matching long-sleeved shirt. Both garments were white, matching the surrounding room. The complete lack of color was unnerving, making the space feel sterile. She stood just as a figure became visible, silhouetted through the curtain. Azur entered, pushing the curtain aside. Except, after a moment, she realized it wasn't Azur. This Scanarian had some pigment on its neck and the sides of its face, a subtle but noticeable pink tint. It was also dressed in white, but its garment was a single, skin-tight suit ending midway down the creature's unnaturally long arms and legs. Its hands and feet were bare, revealing 16 fingers and toes that ended in sharp claws in place of nails. "Look who is finally awake," said the creature cheerfully, strolling to Evelyn's side. It took her a second to realize that they weren't speaking English, though she could understand the language as clearly and easily as if she had spoken it her whole life. The creature reached down and grabbed Evelyn's face in its hands. They were uncomfortably cold. She tried to jerk back, but its grip was firm, and it gently turned her head back and forth, examining her eyes the same way a doctor might have. "You look good. There don't appear to be any complications from the surgery. Welcome aboard, Evelyn." Evelyn blinked. "Surgery?" she asked, raising her hands to examine her own face. It didn't feel any different. "What's going on? Where are we?" "You're on a Scanarian ship, currently traveling away from Earth. You've just undergone neural surgery, Sweet Pea. It's normal to be disoriented." She, Evelyn thought it was a she, spoke with a distinctly feminine voice, and her speech had a vaguely southern accent. Sweet Pea. Evelyn thought she must have misunderstood. None of this was making any sense. Fear and confusion rose within her, but she pushed them down. "What did you do to me?" Evelyn asked, backing away, her voice wary. "Now, don't get your panties in a knot. You've had neural pathways artificially carved into your brain tissue to allow you to speak and understand Common. Every member of the Understanding speaks Common, and we're required to implant the language in all new assassins." The woman gave Evelyn a smile and a wink. It was definitely a wink, and this time, Evelyn was positive that she hadn't misunderstood the woman's words. The woman bustled out of the room before Evelyn could ask anything further. She was left standing alone, more confused than before. She took a second to examine the room she was in more thoroughly. There was a small chest growing out of the wall, filled with more of the same clothing she was currently wearing. Beside it was another narrow, domed doorway. She entered and discovered a small bathroom. It had a reflective surface on one wall, but it didn't look like a mirror. More like a projection, though the image was reversed, as it would be in a reflection. She looked terrible, tired, almost gaunt, her shoulder-length hair frizzing out all over the place. She dug through the bathroom's cabinet, and to her surprise, found a small hairbrush along with a toothbrush, toothpaste, and other toiletries that could have been purchased anywhere on Earth. She mechanically ran the brush through her hair, removing the worst of the knots before the sound of the curtain once again interrupted her. "Evelyn," cried Azur. Her voice was also feminine, and her accent matched the other woman's. "I'm so glad to see you're awake. Now we can have a proper conversation. I cannot tell you how much I hate using the translators. I am just so tickled that you have decided to come on board as one of our assassins. You have an incredible amount of potential." Azur wore a uniform similar to the other Scanarian, except that its edges were lined in a bright silver trim. Her wig was gone, revealing her bald head. As she spoke, she clasped her 8 fingers together with what seemed like genuine excitement. Her energy level was the same as it had been at the police station, but without the translator as a mediator, it was almost overwhelming. Still on edge and not sure how to feel about any of this, Evelyn focused on the reason she was here. They could help her find Mildred, assuming she could do well in their competition. She tried to relax, slipping into the persona she wore at work. "It's nice to meet you, ma'am. Properly, I mean." "Oh, please, call me Azur. You are correct. I am an egg layer, so in Earth terms, I am a female. However, we Scanarians don't do the marriage thing, so if you really have to be polite, I would be a miss." The more she communicated with the Scanarians, the more Evelyn wondered about their similar body language and expressions. The way they were speaking was so colloquial. It wasn't right. "Now, I know you probably have just about a million questions, my dear, and don't worry, we will get to them." Azur spun around, walking to the curtain, and pushed it aside. "If you're ready, we can go to our presentation space and start getting you up to speed. However, if you need a few minutes to bathe or otherwise collect yourself, please feel free to take them. Everyone handles this differently, but we know it's a lot. We want you to be as comfortable as possible." Evelyn opened her mouth to tell Azur she was fine, then reconsidered. She hadn't had a chance to properly wash herself since she had gone to work the day before. Suddenly, she felt sticky with dried sweat and blood that she knew wasn't really there. "A bit of time to myself would be appreciated." Azur nodded, looking empathetic, and stepped out. Around half an hour later, Evelyn felt better. She was clean, and they had brought her some oatmeal-like food to eat. It had been bland but satisfying, and she realized she was starving the second she put the first spoonful into her mouth. She ate slowly, taking time to process everything that had happened, to think through what she wanted to ask Azur. Cautiously, Evelyn stuck her head out past the curtain, looking back and forth down the hallway. It was the same as her room, white and seamless, lacking any sharp corners or color. To her left, she could see 2 more arched doorways like her own, also covered by curtains. "Evelyn?" A voice came from the other direction, and she turned to see the Scanarian that wasn't Azur rounding the corner and approaching. "If you're ready, you can follow me right this way." The second woman led her to a larger room. There was a long table at its center, and Azur sat next to it in what looked to be the only chair. As Evelyn approached, another chair sprouted from the floor, quickly growing to fill the space next to Azur. The woman gestured at the newly formed chair, acting like nothing unusual had happened, inviting Evelyn to sit. As Evelyn tentatively sat down, the chair adjusted up and forward, spacing her at a comfortable distance from the table. It formed around her backside, contouring around her body. Azur saw her eyeing the seat uneasily and laughed. "It'll take you a few days to get used to Scanarian architecture. Our specialty, even before we joined the Understanding, has always been micro-artificial intelligences. The entire ship is made of small, synchronized units that adjust their shape and function as needed. We do try to include a few human comforts, though, to make the transition easier." Evelyn thought of the bed she had woken up in, and the curtain covering the door. There was also a human toilet in the bathroom. Compared to everything that Evelyn had experienced the last day or so, this seemed easy to accept. The chair was actually quite comfortable, and she felt herself relaxing just a little. All right, Azur nodded excitedly. Let's get started. We have a standard presentation going over the history of the understanding, but before we get into that, you can go ahead and ask me anything you like. How are we communicating like this? Evelyn asked immediately. She had a major in linguistics and spoke several languages with varying degrees of fluency. Communicating in a new language always took time, even when you had mastered the grammar and had a decent vocabulary. Especially when speaking casually, every language was full of idiomatic expressions and phrases that didn't literally translate. That wasn't happening here. You and the other woman have been calling me pet names. Sweet pea, dear. She told me not to get my panties in a knot. Those are human, English expressions. They shouldn't exist since we aren't speaking English anymore. Azur nodded. It's because we're speaking common. Common isn't a native language anywhere. It's a language that was developed by the sniffers. We'll get to them. To allow easy communication between different species. Everyone has the language surgically implanted into their brains when they reach adolescence, after they have gained native fluency in whatever language their species speaks. This allows it to be a middle ground language, emphasizing meaning over literal translation. I don't understand, said Evelyn. Of course you don't, Azur said, smiling. Let's use an example. Take the sentence, bitch, you really went out and stabbed some asshole with a goddamn umbrella? Bitch, to me, literally refers to a small, fuzzy creature we keep as pets. But it's also a slightly insulting term of endearment, which is how I'm using it now. An asshole is like a septic tank. It's a storage container for, excretions. And it's a common slang term for a really vile individual. Goddamn umbrella is just the word umbrella, which is something everybody has, with an emphatic accent placed on it. I don't know how your brain literally interprets what I just said, but the meaning should be approximately the same. It's not perfect, but usually we can get our points across. It made sense, sort of, and Evelyn had to stop the linguistic part of her brain from hijacking the conversation. She could ask for details later. Okay, what about your body language? I thought you were just imitating human body language before, to put me at ease, but now I'm not so sure. I don't think it would look so natural, Azur finished for her, her wide, unsettling smile splitting her face. To some extent, it's because I have spent a lot of time with humans and have learned what you understand and what you don't. However, as you have guessed, the actual answer is more complicated. It will be easier to explain if you let me go through the presentation about the understanding first. Would that be okay? Evelyn nodded, curious. Azur settled into her chair. Her tone turned businesslike, falling into the rhythm of a lecture she had given many times. I'll start with my people, the Skenaros. Our homeworld is called Over. We live on the main planet and 3 of its 4 moons. About 12,000 years ago, that's Skenarian years, not Earth years, an alien race called the Sniffers made contact with us. Evelyn's eyebrows went up. Sniffers. The literal meaning of the word seemed too deliberate to be a coincidence. Sniffers, confirmed Azur. Their primary language is pheromone-based. They needed a name the rest of us could pronounce, and they, regrettably, left the decision to others. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The wall to Evelyn's right shifted, resolving into a subtly moving image. It looked like a projection, but Evelyn suspected the pigments came directly out of the wall. The image was something that vaguely resembled an ant. It had a pitch-black, glistening body divided into the 3 body segments seen in many earth insects. From the middle section sprouted 8 long, arched legs, each ending in a serrated point. Beside the legs, 4 prominent feelers grew from what she thought must be its head. 2 of the feelers were on either side of a butterfly-like proboscis, and 2 grew from where its eyebrows would have been if it had had eyes. The creature was clearly blind. As the image moved, it used its 4 face feelers to guide itself along as it walked. The Sniffers are old, really old, Azur continued. According to them, While most other species were in the aquatic goo phase of their evolution, the sniffers were already a technologically advanced civilization. They have a joint consciousness. It's similar to a hive, but there isn't a queen or other kind of leader. Each of them is a small part of one mind, one individual. They say that gives them an advantage. Each individual's intelligence compounds into a huge, super complex mind. I'm not sure how much truth there is to that, but they are undeniably the most technologically advanced life form in our corner of the universe. Honestly, no one else even comes close. According to them, they first focused entirely on their own society. They figured out how to produce unlimited clean energy, how to create and distribute resources so that none of them were ever in need. They bred out most illnesses and found cures for the rest, even stopping and reversing aging, making them all effectively immortal. It was all to craft what they considered a perfect society. Once they had perfected their homeworld, they left for the stars. They found many forms of intelligent life, and for thousands of years the sniffers watched and studied them. They didn't just observe, though. They admit they futzed with the social development of different species, resulting in a lot of similarities between them. Similarities like body language, Evelyn asked, skeptical. Like body language, Azur confirmed. The sniffers lack consistency. They didn't interfere so much that we all ended up identical, but the result is we all have quite a bit in common. Most of us use similar body language, especially species that are physically adjacent. Most of us laugh, and we can understand each other's humor. There are a lot more cultural and social similarities. I'm sure you'll pick up on them. However, we can't blame the sniffers for every coincidence. They didn't mess with the biological evolution of any species, at least not that they've admitted. Despite that, there are many physical patterns found between different organisms from different planets. Have you ever heard of the theory of panspermia? Evelyn stared blankly back at her. No, Azur continued, shaking her head. You didn't strike me as that kind of nerd. It's the theory that life naturally propagates through the universe, that everything comes from the same stock, if you will. That is the only explanation we have been able to find for the similar flora and fauna we find everywhere. For example, about 60% of all known intelligent species are upright bipedal, like you and I, and we all have similar body makeups, including skeletal, muscular, and circulatory systems. You guys really got the short end of the stick with the external genitalia. Those, thankfully, are human exclusive as far as I'm aware. The alien was obviously trying to be funny, but humor was lost on Evelyn. It had been since her sister's disappearance. Azur, who had clearly expected a reaction, snorted and raised a non-existent eyebrow. Well, aren't you a bit uptight? We'll have to work on that. Sullen and emotionless plays well for some assassins, but I don't think it will work for you. Evelyn studied her, not sure if that was supposed to be another joke. She ignored the comment, for now, and asked, Okay, back to what you were saying before. What was the point? What were the, sniffers trying to accomplish by nudging different species so that we have social overlaps? They haven't been entirely forthright on that subject, Azur responded. However, we suspect it has to do with communication. As you have pointed out, communication is much easier when species can understand each other's nonverbal cues. It helps us relax around each other, get along quicker and easier. On some level, we think they knew that one day they would make contact. For millennia, they simply watched, not making their presence known. That finally changed with the blimps. The image on the wall blurred and reformed into another creature. It was large, and the main part of its body was spherical, resembling a particularly fat seal. Its face was small and squished, with huge black eyes and a short snout. It had 2 comically small webbed flippers poking out of either side of its torso, and a large finned tail. Short, soft-looking gray fur with a mossy tint covered its entire body. It was clearly aquatic, and it could have been a child's plush toy, if it hadn't been for the tentacles. It had 6 of them, 3 on either side, behind each fin. They were long, also furry, and trailed past the end of its tail. As the image moved, the tentacles rippled unsettlingly around the creature, allowing Evelyn to see the octopus-like suckers lining the underside of each. She couldn't decide if the effect was cute or creepy. Maybe a little of both. The blimps are originally from a planet called Vorlona. It's frankly stunning, a huge tourist destination. It's mostly ocean, and all the cities are underwater. The blimps are an incredibly artistic people, and their cities are famous for their beauty and culture. Their primary language is tonal, so when they speak to each other, they sound like they're singing. It's beautiful. It makes it even more unfortunate that the blimps themselves are genuinely some of the worst beings I have ever had the displeasure of working with. They are aggressive and get offended at the drop of a damn pin. The sniffers say that before they made contact, the blimps almost wiped themselves out multiple times through various wars and conflicts. However, by some miracle they survived and continued to advance. They started inhabiting other planets, bringing their wars into space. The blimps were quickly approaching a point of technological advancement that would allow them to detect the sniffers' presence, and the sniffers were, understandably, concerned about a conflict. The blimps wouldn't have been able to cause them significant harm, but the sniffers are sensitive about losing individuals. Because their intelligence is cumulative, each death damages them as a whole. So, to head off a confrontation, they made first contact. The sniffers offered the blimps access to some of their technologies in exchange for a commitment to peace. Unlimited clean energy, access to plentiful resources, and healthcare that would prolong their lives indefinitely, assuming they didn't do anything too stupid. The blimps would continue to govern themselves, in whatever manner they chose, so long as they complied with the sniffers' two requests: that all members of their population have access to the sniffer technology, and that all violence, internal and external, be prohibited. The blimps accepted, and so the understanding was born. Evie snorted at that. "Sure," she said. "How long did that last? Their promise to let the blimps govern themselves without sniffer interference." Azur smiled knowingly. "Believe it or not, it has lasted to this day. Everyone is always skeptical about that at first. The sniffers lead the understanding, and so are unquestionably in charge, but they take little interest in how each species governs itself, so long as everyone is following the rules. As far as we can tell, they are entirely motivated by a desire to avoid conflict. They seem much more interested in being a silent observer than an overbearing leader, which is why the system works. Currently, there are 57 species in the understanding. The sniffers make the offer to any race that has progressed to where they will soon be able to detect and potentially harm the understanding. No one has ever refused the offer once it's been explained to them." Evelyn thought about the ramifications an offer like this would have. An end to disease, hunger, and access to unlimited clean energy would solve so many problems. But an immediate end to all violence didn't seem realistic. "What happens when people, or governments, don't keep that promise?" she asked. "How do the sniffers handle violations?" "Depends on the scale," Azur replied. "When a race joins the understanding, it's expected that there will be a few decades of adjustment. Local conflicts are resolved with sniffer intervention when needed. Governments restructure themselves and write and enforce new laws. Usually there is some pushback, but it dies down as everyone becomes accustomed to the new resources. After that, minor violations, from individuals mostly, are handled internally by each species. The sniffers have methods in place to confirm this is being done, but like I said, they stay out of it unless they feel the situation isn't being handled correctly. Larger conflicts, like between neighboring countries or different species, are first mediated internally. If they can't reach a resolution on their own, the sniffers will become involved, and whatever solution they decide on is final." Evelyn considered, fascinated. "Do you still have things like money, jobs?" "Excellent question," replied Azur. "The answer is, it depends. So long as we honor the agreement of the understanding, the rest is up to each individual species. We Scanarians still use a lot of systems you would recognize, like money, trade, and the economy. Every individual receives a basic income. Some are content with that. However, many of us still choose to work. Having access to the sniffer tech doesn't remove the need for builders, scientists, engineers, and other professions. The sniffers don't explain their knowledge to us, but they don't stop us from continuing to learn and advance on our own. There are also a bunch of industries that span over the entire understanding. Tourism is huge, especially with so many new worlds to explore. But the biggest industry by far is entertainment. Evelyn nodded slowly. Entertainment like the assassination simulation? Exactly, replied Azur. Conflict and competition are natural tools many races use to advance themselves, and the lack of it is difficult for some. Many species turn to sports and other competitions as a stand-in to help ease tensions internally. However, sports between different species get complicated because of differences in physiology, atmosphere, gravity, etc. Really, the only competitions held between different species are mental ones. Mental games? You mean like chess? Evie asked, forgetting for a moment that she was talking to an alien. Azur thought for a moment. Oh, you mean that cute little strategy game that humans play with the little men and horses? Yes. Exactly like chess. But those kind of games don't scratch the same itch, if you know what I mean. Predictably, the blimps were one of the races having trouble with the no-violence rule. Once it was no longer just them, they quickly took issue with pretty much everyone. So, about 600 years ago, the blimps proposed what would become the assassination simulation. Sniffer tech can resurrect individuals, so long as they die under specific conditions. The blimps proposed some regulated, light-hearted violence as a form of conflict mediation. The Sniffers squashed the idea right away, despite widespread interest, because they thought any violence between members of the understanding would escalate and cause bigger issues. Many were upset by this, so the Sniffers eventually came up with a compromise. They agreed to allow individuals from species outside the understanding to take part, so long as they met certain criteria. The individuals chosen had to have already committed violence on their own accord, killing at least one member of their own race. They also had to be willing, well-compensated participants. That agreement, over the years, has morphed into the assassination simulation. Each season, 3 species are selected to participate. We hire and train assassins like yourself, and then the entire understanding watches as you all attempt to kill eligible targets, usually politicians and high-ranking officials. It's incredibly popular and therapeutic. Everyone enjoys watching their enemies' politicians die, especially when it's all in good fun. This season, it's us, the Blimps, and another race called the Honrad. The Blimps actually lobbied the Sniffers to make the Honrad take part. The Honrad have never showed any interest in participating in the sim before this season. They must have deeply offended the Blimps by doing something unforgivable, like forgetting to wish a member of the Blimps royal family happy birthday. And now they are being forced to take part to keep the peace. That's where you're headed, to the Honrad home planet. The Honrad are also pretty awful in their own special way. Just a heads up, invest in some nose plugs before we land. Azur was interrupted by another Scanarian entering the room. He walked up to her, holding some kind of tablet, looking a little embarrassed. Oh heavens, is it that time already? Azur quickly stood. She glanced down at Evelyn. I'm sorry, dear, I have to go. I'll have Myra come in and escort you to the medbay for your medical exam. And before Evelyn could say anything in response, the two quickly walked out of the room. For a few minutes, Evelyn sat alone, thinking through everything Azur had just told her. It was interesting, to be sure, but all that really mattered was that she did well. She had to end up at the top 25%. She had to get that boon, even if there was only a chance that it could bring Mildred back. At the very least, she would finally know what had happened and be able to make those responsible pay. A few minutes later, the pink-scaled Scanarian from earlier walked into the room. Azur had called her Myra. I'm sorry, my dear. We shouldn't have left you hanging like that, but Azur is an important woman and she had to get to a meeting. She asked me to escort you to the medbay, if you're ready. Evelyn stood, and the chair pulled away from her, disappearing back into the floor. One more thing before we go. Myra pulled another of the tablet-like devices from her pocket. We need to know what name you would like to go by. You can use your own, or come up with a fancy nickname if you like. It's up to you, but it will be what you go by until this season finishes. Evelyn thought for a moment. Call me Evie, she said. Mildred had always called her Evie. It felt right. Myra smiled at her. Welcome, Evie, to the assassination simulation.